Good afternoon and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. I'm pleased to be the moderator for this discussion on a key topic of ADL's international affairs agenda, anti-Semitism across borders. For decades, we've seen anti-Semitism from a variety of sources. Anti-Semitism is an ideological fixture of the far right, the far left, and radical Islamism. Anti-Semitism also stems from bias against those who are different, those who are looking for a scapegoat, or just out of ignorance. The advent of social media, however, has allowed anti-Semitic rhetoric to spread, both by ideologues pushing an agenda of hate and by people with biases who share anti-Semitic statements or memes. And that spread knows no borders. ADL published a groundbreaking report on one of the most dangerous aspects of this phenomenon exactly a year ago. The report, titled Hate Beyond Borders, the Internationalization of White Supremacy, looked at surging violence in the US, Europe, and beyond, motivated by elements of white supremacy. The report analyzed how white supremacist killers influence and inspire one another, and how European and American adherents are learning from each other, supporting each other, and reaching new audiences. It was written in cooperation with leading European extremism researchers from the UK, Germany, France, Poland, and Sweden. Today, we're going to look at how anti-Semitic rhetoric appears in 3 countries, Germany, the UK, and Chile, and to discuss commonalities across borders, both to the US and among those countries. We're privileged to have 4 excellent panelists for this discussion. Dr. Kim Robin-Stoller is the co-founder and chair of the board of directors of the International Institute for Education and Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin, which focuses its work on contemporary anti-Semitism, Islamism, and right-wing extremism with an international perspective. Dr. Dave Rich is the Director of Policy for CST, the Community Security Trust in the USA. CST provides physical security, training, and advice for the protection of British Jews and assists those who are victims of anti-Semitism and monitors anti-Semitic activities and incidents. Dave is also the author of the book, The Left's Jewish Problem, and CST was a contributor to the report I mentioned earlier. Sophia Cohen is the Director of Institution Relations at the Jewish Interactive Museum of Chile, whose mission is to educate the general public about the Jewish people and their impact on society. And the museum's goals is to increase knowledge so that anti-Semitic propaganda will be more easily rejected. And our very own Marilyn Mayo is Senior Research Fellow at ADL Center on Extremism. Marilyn's work closely with ADL's International Affairs team and was the principal author of the Hate Beyond Border report, which I mentioned. While anti-Semitism manifests in all its varieties in each of these countries, I've asked our panelists to give opening remarks on specific topics. Kim will speak on the far right and Islamist anti-Semitism in Germany. Dave will speak on the far left anti-Semitism in the UK. Sophia will speak on the main aspects of anti-Semitism in Chile, and Marilyn on our Hate Beyond Borders report. Afterwards, we will discuss common themes and even extremist cooperation across borders. For those of you watching, please don't forget to use the chat box feature to the right of the video to put questions for the Q&A segment, which will happen at the end of the session. Please type questions throughout the panel, and our Q&A moderator will select a few to ask panelists after the initial discussion is complete. So with that, we'll start with Marilyn. Marilyn, if you could set us off, please, by going over some of the main findings of the report that we published last year at ADL, and if you could set the stage for us, please.
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am, very excited to participate in this international panel today and to discuss these issues with my esteemed colleagues from abroad. And that is because I'll just say at the very start that the only way to combat global anti-Semitism is through global participation and monitoring, and also, and exposing extremists and anti-Semites. As Sharon said, about a year ago, ADL released a joint report on international white supremacy with colleagues, as Sharon mentioned, in France, Sweden, Germany, Poland, and the UK. And at that time, we saw that there was an uptick in interaction between white supremacists in the US and Europe, and that there were a number of influencers in various countries that were actually pushing people towards extremism. So our research showed that European and American extremists are actually interacting in many different ways, and also, as Sharon said, learning from each other and supporting each other. So you have extremists who are certainly interacting online, but you also have people who are meeting in person in conferences, or at conferences. Obviously, this was before the pandemic, but we see that our research showed that because it's so easy to communicate across borders, obviously through social media and other means, that these influencers that were different in different countries. These are people who whose works are known to let's say white supremacists in various countries, and that would be people like Kevin McDonald, who's an anti-Semite, a well-known anti-Semite in the U.S., David Duke, who's a well-known anti-Semite, Jared Taylor, another one. These people travel around, but they also have online sites which give information. And we know that the people that they especially reach are young white males. And many of these young white males think it's funny to post awful memes and disturbing memes about, for example, pushing Jews into ovens. And they promote this kind of bigoted humor. So, what we saw is that the fact that they have access to all kinds of social media allows this easy dissemination of this, ideology that's anti-Semitic, that's racist. And we have seen, for example, a number of neo-Nazi groups like Atomwaffen and the Führerkrieg division form online with members from all over the world, and that interact regularly. But it's not just online activity that concerns us. These online interactions often lead to real-world incidents. So, over the past decade, we've seen a surge in violence in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. And, these incidents are motivated by anti-Semitism and racism and anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-immigration sentiment. And what happens when a white supremacist like Robert Bowers kills 11 people in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, or Brenton Tarrant, another white supremacist, kills 51 people in mosques in New Zealand? Well, other extremists around the world revel in these acts, and these acts of violence, and they see them as a kind of victory, and they also feel motivated to carry out acts of violence and raise fears in the communities they target. And we saw this in the United States a lot last year. Obviously in the El Paso situation, where a young white supremacist who was influenced by things he was reading and something called the Great Replacement, which is a theory that whites are being replaced by non-whites in various countries. This caused him to literally go and kill 24 people in El Paso and injure many others. So, what is the climate that we are seeing that is allowing this resurgence of anti-Semitism and white supremacy here in the United States and abroad? Well, we live in polarized societies in the US and elsewhere, and there's a focus on changing demographics and a feeling among disaffected whites, mostly in the US, but I think elsewhere, that their societies and countries are being overwhelmed by non-white immigrants from other countries. And white supremacists and anti-Semites, they exploit that sentiment, and they insist that it's the Jews who are pushing for immigration, touting globalism and diversity, and they're angry, and Jews are easy to scapegoat and blame for societal ills. And we saw this year in particular with the coronavirus and QAnon. We know that in the US and Europe, anti-Semites pushed the idea that the coronavirus was a tool for Jews to expand their global influence. And we also saw that QAnon followers, who believe that a satanic cabal of elitists are kidnapping young children, off the streets and draining their blood. We see that this is like a direct correlation to the blood libel that has been generated, for centuries in Europe. So, and QAnon theories, which are very uniquely American in some ways, have now made their way to Europe, especially in the UK and in Germany. So there's a lot to talk about with regard to these issues, and I'll conclude by saying that there's a role for all of us to play in combating global anti-Semitism, and it starts in our own communities and expands out into greater circles. And we know that all different people, political leaders, and social media companies, and educators, etc., have a role to play in tamping down this extreme rhetoric and hatred that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn, so much. Maybe we'll turn to Germany first, Kim, and if you can kind of give us the view from the other side of the Atlantic and tell us a little bit about how some of the themes that Marilyn has raised here, how do they manifest themselves in Germany, and what are you seeing and what are you monitoring?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here at this very interesting event, and also to put a spotlight on the international connection on different phenomena which we see here in Germany, but we already noticed a long time ago, let's say 1 or 2 decades, that on the 2 subjects I'm supposed to speak on, there is a quite important international connection. Like on the one hand, the Islamist side, and on the other hand, like the right-wing, neo-Nazi, and also populist side. So turning first to the right-wing side, like in Germany in general, like in the 90s, we had a very strong revival of neo-Nazi groups and strong movements from those sides who attacked almost regularly every day immigrants, like people who didn't appear to be in their worldview to be accepted, and asylum seeker, refugees, LGBTIQ people, and so on. So this is not specifically something new. This is, I would say, to a certain extent, German origin, like with the Nazi past. But there was a revival after the reunification when the Germans felt strong again and saw there's a lot possible. But over the last decade, there has been a shift also in internationalization, specifically with the so-called populist movements on the right. For example, we have the AfD, which is the alternative for Germany, which is mainly now anti-immigrant and to a certain extent also anti-Semitic party, which tends to overcome the current state as it is. Like it's being perceived, I would say, to a certain extent, like in the US with some of the populist movements, that the state is like governed by the wrong people and the elite and this anti-elitist discourse, and that the movement and the real people have to change the system and overcome the system. So this is the on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, we saw during terrorist attacks like the Halle attacks last year, where right-wing terrorist guy tried to kill as many people in the synagogue as possible, but he wasn't able to do so, luckily. But then he turned, after being able to attack the Jews, he turned to the immigrants and try to kill them. And also what Marilyn mentioned before, there has been this very strong male impetus and yeah, let's say hatred against women and LGBTIQ people. So he also killed a woman and so on, a random person. So this is or shot. So this is something. Where I would say there are some similarities from internationalization, also in the context that the live streaming of such events is taking place now internationally and is motivating or supposed to motivate other people to repeat such actions. Turning to the Islamist chapter, like we saw in general in Europe, many jihadi attacks over the last decade, and if not the first or the primary goal, Jewish and Israeli institutions were the second or the third target most often. So attackers might have had the first goal to attack Jewish facilities or other facilities, but on their list, quite often, Jewish or Israeli targets were also mentioned. This mainly by the Sunni jihadists. Turning the eye to the Iranian threat in Germany, we know that the Iranians were spying on Jewish and Israeli related targets, like in preparation for potential attacks, and also like the Iranian affiliate, Hezbollah, are strong in spotting and spying on Jewish institutions. So there is a real potential security threat there in case of a broader escalation. And we also had several terrorist attacks in Europe inspired from this area in the Middle East over the last years. So in Germany, we have a specific situation as there is a strong immigration community coming from Turkey. So coming from Turkey, and in general, Turkey is currently trying to mobilize with anti-Semitic tropes against Israel and implicitly, in general, against the Jews with an expansionist policy. So, and this affects specifically the Turkish immigrant community with a nationalist and Islamist discourse by Erdogan, mobilizing to a certain extent against the Jews. And in general, affiliated with Turkey, and over the last years, Turkey tried to be the center of the anti-Western and anti-Israel front. The Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in Europe are being mobilized in Turkey and by Turkey as well. So there were several conferences in Turkey where Muslim Brotherhood organizations together with Salafi jihadi organization met specifically around the topic against Israel. This is a major concern also because they are the most...
Kim, I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting you. I think there's some technical difficulty. I'm being asked to tell to our audience, and if you came to this page to see the panel from quad to keyboard, please go back to the Never Is Now website and go to the link listed on Anti-Semitism Across Borders. The YouTube links were switched accidentally, so apologies to our audience. If you can realize that you're in the wrong panel, please go back to the website and click on the right on the other panel title. So this is now Anti-Semitism Across Borders. If you're interested on the panel from quad to keyboard, go ahead back to the website and click on Anti-Semitism Across Borders, which is the wrong name, but unfortunately that's some of the, yeah, that's what I'm being told to do. So we will continue with our conversation. So Kim, back to you. I apologize for interrupting you, but I want to make sure that our audience members are on the right panel. Go ahead, please, Kim. Apologies.
No, no problem. So, but yeah, so I welcome also the other viewers who are supposed to watch a different one. So I might speak a little bit about the online aspect here as well. So, like in general, what we see in Europe and in Germany, that the mobilization of anti-Semitism is specifically violent in Arab and Turkish discourse. So as a primary language. So this is like the kind of internationalization, like compared to the German and other European languages, it's much better controlled, like by Facebook, by YouTube, and others, than the Arabic and Turkish discourse here. So this is one thing. I think there's a cross or international perspective. It's important what can be done there, because this is actually this discourse is mobilizing directly for attacks against Jews, which is less taking place in more controlled languages as Germany with Facebook, for example. But in general, we also are facing the problem that many, at least from the right-wingers and neo-Nazi groups, turned to the non-controlled news channels and also to the messengers like Telegram, where it's much more difficult to be able to counter them because they're not so controlled by the European or national institutions in Europe. Okay, I leave it.
Right. Thank you, Kim, so much. We'll turn to the UK next. Dave, if you can please give your perspective from the UK and kind of how you're seeing exactly these themes manifest in the community that you're monitoring and you're watching.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to the ADL for inviting me onto this panel. The story of anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom over the last 5 years has been dominated by discussions about and arguments about anti-Semitism on the left. And this has been very unusual and a very strange experience for the Jewish community. Firstly, because historically we're used to tackling anti-Semitism from the far right, and in more recent years, anti-Semitism from extreme jihadist and Islamist movements. And now all of a sudden it was coming from the left, who are supposed to be the anti-racist part of the political spectrum, but also because it didn't come from the extremes. It came in mainstream politics, and it happened because Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party 5 years ago, and he remained leader until April of this year. And under his leadership, for various reasons, the Labour Party began to attract people with anti-Semitic views, but with a particular type of anti-Semitic views. This was a kind of anti-Semitism that mixed up extreme hatred of Israel and a view of Zionism as a racist ideology of global power that resided not just in Israel, but in Washington and New York and London and elsewhere, mixed with a view of Jews as rich and right-wing and not part of the progressive people, the progressive movement that Jeremy Corbyn, who came from a very radical part of the left-wing spectrum, represented. And what happened was these ideas, this kind of almost progressive anti-Semitism, but mixed in with very old-fashioned stereotypes about Jews and money and so on, that had always sort of hung around the fringes of the left. They flooded into mainstream politics. And Jewish people who were in the Labour Party in the UK found themselves increasingly alienated, victimised, harassed, and pushed out and started to leave. There were some very high-profile cases of Jewish members of parliament, especially female Jewish members of parliament, such as Luciana Berger, Louise Ellman, Ruth Smith, and others who received unbelievable amounts of abuse and death threats and so on, some of whom left the party as a result. There were thousands of Jewish members who had this experience. And it came to a head with a complaint to the UK's official anti-racism regulator. We have a body in the United Kingdom called the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they are an official legal regulator that is there to enforce equalities laws in the UK. The only other political party they've ever investigated is the British National Party, which is a tiny kind of neo-fascist party. But they investigated the Labour Party, and a couple of weeks ago they ruled that the Labour Party had broken anti-discrimination law in this country. And this was a huge moment in British politics and in British Jewish life, because it was very validating for the Jewish community. And the new leadership of the Labour Party have really taken this on and are trying to bring about change. But what happened really taught us a few things about how anti-Semitism is changing. The first one is this merger of anti-Semitic ideas from different extremes, kind of blurring together, mixing together in this big conspiracy soup that exists on the internet, where you will get people who consider themselves to be left-wing, who are members of left-wing movements, who see themselves as anti-racist, grabbing anti-Semitic images from literally neo-Nazi websites, posting them into their We Love Jeremy Corbyn Facebook group, and getting hundreds of likes as a result, and not being able to see the problem. And social media played a huge part in this. Facebook groups in particular, private, hidden Facebook groups, played a radicalizing role, where the people running these groups, the people dominating the discourse in these groups, would set the tone for any conversation about Jews, anti-Semitism, Israel, the Holocaust, anything related. And other people would either have to go along with it or they'd get squeezed out. So people would get radicalized. And they would get radicalized also because they saw Jeremy Corbyn as someone they wanted to support for lots of positive reasons, for broader progressive politics. And if he's getting attacked for anti-Semitism, they're just going to have to defend him. So they defend their guy. And I think we see this in lots of our politics. If people see a leader as their guy, their leader, they will basically defend pretty much anything, right? And this is what we experienced. And of course, what we've seen this year is a much broader growth in conspiracy theories related to coronavirus, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories really growing, QAnon ideas coming in from the US to the UK, and anti-Semitism always finds its place. And there's this anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories provide this golden thread that links anti-Semitism to all these other political movements. And I'm afraid to say, I think we have a big challenge on our hands. There was an opinion poll done just recently, published a couple of weeks ago in the UK by an anti-fascist, anti-hate organisation called Hope Not Hate. And it was part of a big research project they did into QAnon support in the UK. But there was one question in their opinion poll that jumped out at me, and this is what I'm going to end on, really. They asked the question, to what extent do you agree Jews have disproportionate control of powerful institutions and use that power for their own benefit and against the good of the general population? Right? It's a standard anti-Semitic conspiracy question. What jumped out at me is that younger people were much, much more likely to agree with this than older people. There was an age break at around 40, 45 years of age. People below that age, 2 or 3 times as likely to agree as people who are older. And between the most 30% of 25 to 34-year-olds agreed with that statement. Now, I think there's lots of reasons we can think about that explain this. There's the distance from the Holocaust and from the Second World War. There's changing perceptions of Israel over time. But I think the role of social media, the use of social media, and the prevalence of conspiracy theories, where kids growing up today, of school age, of university age, are so familiar with conspiracy theories as just a normal way of explaining the world. And where that's the case, where you believe, of course, there's a secret rich elite running things, anti-Semitism just has an easy home and a ready home. And I think we have a big challenge on our hands.
Thank you, Deb, for that sobering assessment. I guess that's a perfect segue now to shift our focus to Latin America and to Chile. And Sophia, maybe you can kind of set the stage for us, for our audience, about the Jewish community of Chile, and what is your, manifestation of anti-Semitism? How does it really show itself in your community and in your lives?
Thank you, Sharon. I'm very, very honored to be part of this panel. And a little bit of a spoiler, here my co-speakers, we have so many things in common in our communities. We have realities that are shared. It doesn't matter that we're in different countries or different hemispheres. The reality is the same or similar. I might say that we have like a salad of everything that you just said. But first of all, let me tell you a little bit of the Chilean Jewish community. We're a very small community with 14,000 members. That means that almost 1 out of 1,000 is Jewish in Chile. We have 14 synagogues and 3 day schools, so we are very small. And actually, if you have invited me to this conversation a little bit more than a year ago, I would be reporting something very different, because we have had, well, you might have seen it on the news, we have a very different social and political reality. We just voted a few weeks ago a referendum to write a new constitution, and it passed. And we're going to write it with a constitutional assembly. That means that regular people are going to be in charge of writing this new constitution. And this is the result of social protests that we have at the end of last year that became violent. So as you see, we have this is a whole new world for us politically and socially. But focusing on anti-Semitism, that's what brings us together. Let me tell you, even though I'm happy to report that we haven't had any major terrorist attacks, we have had incidents of harassment and vandalism, and they're escalating. The first thread that I have to lay out is the classical anti-Semitism. That is something that we can find in our general population. There is a fragile tolerance against minorities. We have had large immigration movements toward Chile, but especially towards the Jewish community. We are like the stars of the migration, even if we have been here for a long time. And basically what we feel is that the feeling of anti-Semitism toward us because of lack of knowledge about what the Jews are in general. And whenever we work at the museum and we get visitors, we get claims, and I was listening to Marilyn and this like popped in my head. We hear things like, question, did you kill Jesus? Question, do you still use children's blood during your ceremonies? Question, is it true that all Jews are rich? And so on and so on. This goes with the classical rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric. Also, when we post something on our web or on our social media, we get, for instance, if we post something about the Holocaust, we're going to get people saying, oh, again, you come with the holocuento, which means the holo tale. The Holocaust is a lie. We get a lot of deniers from the Holocaust deniers. And if we get to post something about the life in the ghettos, people are going to write down, but why are you talking about ghettos that happened more than 80 years ago when Israel has an open sky ghetto in Palestine? So this is our reality every day. For example, other examples that when we go to schools, we have an educational resource we did based on the ADL pyramid of hate. And when we go to schools, the teachers interrupt us and say, how can you talk about human rights when you're harassing the Palestinians? And this goes on. And this only in schools. When we go to universities, we have a strong BDS movement, which I think is common to all of us, and we know the consequences. And well, that's only in the academic world. When we move to the political sphere, we have an extreme right that is rising. Maybe some of you saw in the news a picture of neo-Nazis parading in the streets. This was during a peaceful demonstration, and this neo-Nazi group were exhibiting anti-Israeli flags and Nazi symbols, and nothing happened, not even a sanction. It was just a good picture to be shown in the newspapers. Also, some of the members of these neo-Nazi groups that were in this demonstration, they're running for positions within the Constitutional Assembly that's gonna write our new constitution. So we have a lot to worry on the right. But When we move to the left, well, the scenario is not very encouraging, though. We have a Palestinization of the left. We have a pro-Palestine support group in Congress that is conformed by 90 out of 155 members of the Chamber of Deputies. And what's more interesting, and Dave said something about this, that it's transversal. We have politicians from the right, from the center, and from the left joining into the cause of the Palestinian people, which has been a way to clean anti-Semitic views. Last week, for example, the Senate passed a resolution that asked President Piñera to adopt a boycott law against Israel. And also, recently, the Chilean Senate summoned a Palestinian ambassador here in Chile to analyze the Palestine situation. During this meeting, the Palestinian ambassador made some remarks such as, "The terrorists that attack the Israeli population are martyrs and the best of us." He also said that Chilean Jews are loyal to Israel, not to Chile, while the Chilean Palestinians are loyal to Chile. And not like in the Corbyn case, nothing happened. He's still an ambassador. We still like him, and he's going to be in office for a while. And these hostilities are cast on to our local community. For example, last Rosh Hashanah, our community sent out jars of honey for the Congress members. And some of them sent it back and said, "Thank you, but we don't want your honey. Ask Israel to stop harassing the Palestinians." And also, when there are news about the Middle East, again, the Jewish community is held responsible for the actions of Israel. This is enhanced, and I don't know if the people that are listening to us know it, but we have a large Chilean Palestinian community, one of the largest outside Palestine, and with about around 400,000 members. Even though most of them are Christian, historically we have had very good relationships, but now the leadership of the Palestinian community has been radicalized in the last few decades, and they also receive a lot of support from the media, groups of artists, and opinion leaders. So, for instance, just to give you an example, last week, a Palestinian activist attending a program about memory, history, and justice organized by our National Memorial Museum managed to cancel the course because during the first session, the non-Jewish speaker had claimed that the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust were genocides. In a later interview, the activist argued that the Memorial Museum is victim to Zionist pressure to mention the Holocaust. That's only in our local scenario. When we move forward to a regional scenario, we have, that's what we're discussing today, we have the triple frontier between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil that's very near to us, which is a hotspot for Hezbollah activities. And these cells in the triple frontier are allegedly involved to the AMI attack in Argentina more than 25 years ago. That is why we have been monitoring the growth of the Shiite community in the northern part of Chile for possible nexus with these cells in the triple frontier. So I'm going to leave the conspiracy theories because we have our own conspiracy theory that I want to speak about, but let's get into the conversation, and I'm going to get to that. But as you can see, we have been harassed. Our walls have been sprayed with anti-Semitic graffitis. There are media attacks, pro-Palestinian campaigns, and all of this is growing because we have a poor legislation against hate crimes. Our first law against hate crimes was passed in 2012, and it has centered its actions in the protection of sexual minorities, but not really into anti-Semitism. And you can see that because Chile hasn't adopted the IRA definition. And actually, there is a normalization of hate, especially disguised under the anti-Zionist label, because that is politically correct to be said. Not only, of course, you cannot say that you hate the Jews, but you can say that you're anti-Zionist, and that would be okay. There are micro-discriminations on a daily basis, and jokes are not stopped. And as you can see, we have a hostile environment that is building up. And well, we hope that with education and the writing of this new constitution, we can get to a better scenario. So
Thank
that's
you.
Chile.
Thank you, Sophia. That's tremendous, and I think a lot of information that most of our audience members don't really have access to. So thank you for bringing those to light for us. Obviously, when we discuss all of these issues, the primary concern, and for us at ADL as well, is the security and physical security of the Jewish community. And I know that each of you, with your own organizations and your own daily activities, that is a prime concern. So maybe, Dave, I'll turn to you next and talk literally about what are your concerns about physical safety of the Jewish community of UK, and really link what we see as conspiracy theories turn into physical acts of violence. Conspiracy theories don't just stay in the idea space and on social media platforms. They do kind of manifest and turn themselves into acts of violence, especially when we see through our report that terrorists or extremists are literally reciting the manifestos written by one attacker in one country. They're lifting up that language, using it in perpetrating their own acts of violence. So they're influencing one another, they're copying one another. So if you could talk to us a little bit about CST and kind of how you view the physical security of the community, and how do you, tackle, the things that influence and radicalize lone wolves or others who do perpetrate acts of violence.
Look, sadly, tragically, the terrorist threat to Jewish communities is all too familiar to all of us on both sides of the Atlantic. We saw it in Vienna just last week with a terrorist attack that began at one of the main synagogues there. We don't yet know if the synagogue was supposed to be part of the attack or not, but that's where it began. Fortunately, the building was closed and there was nobody in it. But we've seen it repeatedly in Europe and, of course, in the United States. And we have the same situation in the United Kingdom, whereby the tempo of the frequency of terrorist plots being foiled by the police just keeps going and going and going. I think the police recently announced in the last 3 years they've foiled, I think, 27 different terrorist plots, a mixture of far-right and jihadist. I think more jihadist, but increasingly the number of far-right plots are stepping up. And of course, then there are the others that get through. And what we increasingly see is that even in the plots that do not directly target the Jewish community, there will be evidence of anti-Semitic ideology, anti-Semitic views and conspiracy theories when the police dig down into the ideological motivation and the online activities of these terrorists and would-be terrorists, whichever political background or ideology they come from. And I think as Marilyn explained earlier, the far-right terrorist threat is this very difficult combination of, on the one hand, people acting alone when they carry out an attack. But even though they act alone, they view themselves and they exist as part of a global movement that feed off each other, encourage each other, glorify each other. When they carry out the attacks, they write a manifesto and they film the attack as they're doing it, because they know that means they will be memorialized online on all these social media platforms to then encourage the next attack and the one after that and the one after that. It's a very different model from what we've seen with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, where for all that ISIS tried to encourage this kind of lone wolf activity, this kind of spontaneous, proactive activity in support of ISIS, they still had a base, they had a center, they had a core, a media core. And we've seen a decline in ISIS activity as that was degraded in Syria and Iraq. What's going on with the far right is very different. There's nowhere to really focus on in that way. And it's much more self-sustaining and therefore more threatening. We see in the UK not just an increase in this kind of far-right terror activity, but really worryingly, the ages of the people now being arrested for planning terrorist attacks are getting younger and younger. In the last year, we've had a series of 16, 17-year-olds going through the courts. they all have an online footprint. It's just part of it now. So in terms of the safety and security of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom, this is the threat. The threat is obvious. It's apparent, and we are every day doing what we can to anticipate, to preempt where the threat is coming from, to protect our community from it. We get fantastic support from the government, I have to say. The UK government provides about £14 million a year to pay for security guards, commercial security guards at Jewish schools and synagogues and other buildings. The cooperation with the Home Office and the police, counter-terrorist police, hate crime police and others is really excellent. And this is something that really is cross-party as well. Certainly since April has been fully cross-party. So on that side, we have the support we need, but we know, they only have to get lucky once, as the saying goes, and this is an ongoing threat to the community.
Kim, do you feel that Germany is also well positioned to kind of respond to the kind of physical threats that are kind of facing the Jewish community and broader society, and how would you depict kind of this the efforts to protect Jewish communal life in Germany? And it sounds like the German government does say the right things, but does it actually do the right steps to protect the community? And where are your concerns physically?
Okay, like my position, how I'm speaking here is of course not. It's from a research institute. I'm not responsible for the security of the Jewish community as the CST, for example, which is much deeper in the whole field there. But I think one can say that in general, those buildings which are being protected by police, they're much more secured than those areas which are left without police protection. So especially in smaller communities, in certain schools, there's not enough protection as there should be. Having said this, we luckily haven't had that many terrorist attacks happening in Germany against Jewish institutions over the last years. But what is, let's say, the everyday threat stemming from mainly two fields of society, like the neo-Nazi groups and more Islamists, or to a certain extent also people with a Muslim background who wouldn't say about themselves that they are not Islamists, but even though would attack Jews or Jewish Israelis or Israelis. So from those two corners, we usually see anti-Semitic incidents there where there's an overlapping of a larger Jewish or visible Jewish population and a concentration of neo-Nazi groups, or in areas where there's a larger immigrant community. So there is this everyday threat beside the terror threat as such. And the last point I want to say there is like the whole environment which makes Jews also feel unsafe in Germany. And this, of course, it's not just the physical attacks, but it's the overall discourse. It's very visible now, the topic of terrorist threats or other anti-Semitic attacks over the last years. So it creates an unsafe feeling in the overall community in Germany. So beside that, it's also everything related to Israel. If you're just don't want to mention that you're Jewish at your workspace, for example, because people would then mention something about Israel and what the Jews do in Israel and so on. This is not a very good situation Jews are facing in Germany. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim. I guess that's the same experience, Sophia, that you mentioned for the Jewish community in Chile, where you all felt like you are held responsible for policy decisions being made in Jerusalem. But what are your concerns about the physical safety of the community, and where do those threats, if any, where do they emanate from? And really, what are your real concerns on a day-to-day basis as you send your kids to school, to Jewish day school? What are the concerns of the community physically?
So, as I said before, we haven't had any terrorist attack, but that doesn't mean that we're not aware that this is a possibility, because the terrorist groups work as a network internationally. So we just have to look at Argentina, and they have had 2 major terrorist attacks in their history. So we pay attention to these threats, their security, but I'm not in that area. But what I can say is that we have the atmosphere around it. It's building up. When you have a mayor that says openly that we control the media, or he says into a newspaper, I have problems with the Zionist community here in Chile, you see that the scenario is building up for a threat. Maybe not a terrorist threat, but a lone wolf can get a hold of these ideas. And as I told you before, for instance, we have our own conspiracy theory, which is the Plan Andina, which is the Latinization of the Protocols of Zion, which says that, taking what Herzl wrote in his book at the end of the 19th century, the 20th century, sorry, he said that maybe we could go and live in Argentina. And well, they take that idea, and a Nazi in the 70s made a whole conspiracy theory that said that we are trying to conquer the Chilean and Argentinian Patagonia to create a new state. So, for example, we have members of the Senate asking to get the numbers of tourists, Israeli tourists that are coming to our country, and saying that they want to know because they're sure that these are covered missions, that Israel is sending soldiers to recognize what we want to become the new state of the Jewish people. So I think, Sharon, that our major threat is that there is, as I said, there's no law around this. People can go and say this thing, and the hate is growing. Our security agency has asked for people not to go out in the streets with a yarmulke on. So I think like we are a stage before that what we're seeing in Europe, and we hope that we can stop it. But we see that the hostilities are growing, and that the whole atmosphere is less tolerant to us as a community.
Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. Maybe our last round, we can end on a hopeful note. And I'd really like to start with you, Marilyn, since so much of your research is really looking at negative trends. Let's just talk a little bit about solutions, talk a little bit about hope. In your area, and I'll go around and ask, starting with Marilyn, where do you see solutions lying in some of the challenges that have been highlighted in this panel? Or do you see any areas of hope that things are moving actually in the right direction? Take your pick, whichever you want, either solutions or kind of a hopeful trend that you can share with us, Marilyn.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I do see, this panel is an example. I know that at ADL, I work with our colleagues in other countries in Europe that are combating extremism, and it's what I said in my opening remarks. I do feel that there is a greater awareness of the fact that anti-Semitism is on the rise, not in the United States and in Europe, and I think that there's a sense that it has to be dealt with on some level, and so it's obviously very, very important to get the support of not only the government in terms of like denouncing anti-Semitism, but also, as I mentioned earlier, I think because so much of what we're seeing is people connecting through social media, it's very important for social media companies to play a role in stopping hatred online, because that's where it's festering, that's where it starts, and that's where it then leads to people actually taking real life action. And we've seen this, and I know that my colleagues here have mentioned the fact that people live stream Brenton Tarrant and the guy, the attacker in Halle, of the Halle synagogue, and others have tried to live stream their events, and Brenton Tarrant succeeded, so that they can influence others. So I think there's a role to play by these companies. So I see that even though I think it's been very difficult to get these companies to respond in the way we would like, they are taking steps. Unfortunately, I want to be positive, but once Facebook and Twitter can take down accounts, and then they just go to Parler and Telegram, the extremists. So it has to be an effort on the part of lots of different people in society, law enforcement, educators, politicians, everybody working together. And I think that there's a desire for that to happen. And so I'm looking on the positive side of that. And I think ADL has done a lot of work around the social media companies, and I know that we are. I know for myself with the Center on Extremism, we know how important it is to reach out to allies here in the United States and also abroad to work together to fight, anti-Semitism and extremism.
Well, Kim, any quick hopeful or solutions that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think there were some things happened over the last 5 years in Germany, and also to a certain extent in Europe, which heads towards in a good direction, like beside the bad things happening. So this is the whole aspect on hate crimes legislation changes there. There are the whole regulation of hate speech in social media, the aspect of implementing the IRA definition in European countries, the aspect of starting with national action plans against anti-Semitism, which will come over the next years in several European countries. So there are certain good developments beside the different threats and attacks and whatever things we are facing. So they're also good.
Absolutely. Dave, anything you want to add? Hopeful signs or solutions?
Just what I began with, really, when I talked about the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and that the UK's equalities watchdog or regulator ruled that the party had broken law. As terrible as it is that they broke the law, the fact is the law protected us in that situation. This body is an important democratic institution in the UK, and it worked. Democratic institutions, democratic laws, anti-discrimination laws are there. They have power, and they work to protect the Jewish community. And the Labour Party now, I believe, is on a much more positive track. So I don't think we'll see the same problems from that particular source as we have done over previous years.
That's great. And Sophia, you get the last word of hope or solutions.
Well, actually, in my line of work, we work in the museum with students, and we feel like education is the key to a solution. We have to tackle this problem with the young generations. We have to let them see that hate doesn't give us anything. And we try to work a lot with underprivileged students so that we can level the opportunities to know us also, and not only us, all the minorities. We feel that we have to open up for people to know us a little bit better. And I think that there are two things that are very important. Of course, legislation is important, but I feel that now we're talking about networks that work for the bad, and we can create networks that work to make this better. And I think that this panel is an example of that. We've created a Latin American network for institutions that are studying and working with students around the teachings of the Holocaust. So I feel that there's hope. There's a lot of work to be done. But as your ADL report said, that your last report, people that were exposed to knowing what the Holocaust is about, they're more empathic, they're more open to a multicultural society. So I think, like, yeah, we have a lot of problems, but there's hope. And I think that working together, we can do this a better, we have a better outcome.
Well, on that wonderful positive note, I want to thank this really wonderful panel. Thank you for taking time to be with us. To our listeners, if you joined us late, we apologize for the technical difficulties, and we will be emailing you a link with the full panel afterwards, so you can watch everything that was presented here so eloquently. Thank you all for being with us today. Please go back to our website, see other panels that you'd like to join. And once again, a very, very deep appreciation to these wonderful experts and panelists for being with us today. Thank you so much.